All mics on.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon.
Good
All right, good. Let's get started. I'm Shannon Hader. I'm the Dean of the School of International Service, and I have the real pleasure of welcoming you all today for what is the first of what we think is going to be a series of really great talks on data for impact. So let me introduce that concept a little bit, and then I'll introduce our illustrious speaker, who we're lucky to have here today. But you know, this data for impact sort of theme and series, it really comes out of saying, you know, how do we interrogate something that's so important right now, whether it's access to information or disinformation, it might be, analysis, analytics, artificial intelligence, and frankly, with all of these new tools that are progressing so crazy fast, you know, what does this mean? What does this mean for the work we do in international relations? What does this mean for the work we do in humanity? You know, a couple confessions about why this is a passionate topic for me. Number one, I am a data geek. If there are other data geeks in the room, please raise your hand and out yourself. Thank you. And I'm a data geek, not just because, you know, when I was little, I liked math. I'm a data geek because no matter how complicated or messy or difficult or challenging or, you know, having complexities of ethics and protections data can bring into the picture, really when push comes to shove in my world of global health, in my world of global development, data are really about people. People, they get a bad rap sometimes. Oh, it's all about the numbers. Like, no, these are actually representing people and places and trends and issues that are important that give us signals to be able to then dive in and unpack and get signals that break our assumptions and put us in a whole new direction. Signals that if we care to pay attention, we might act earlier or more comprehensively or more, my passion, particularly differentiated. You know, one of the things I hate about data is the tyranny of the averages, as it's called, you know, where I say, oh, we've got one number, it's a nice average, things are fine, or we know what to do, when in fact that average covers up what's going on underneath the surface. And you need more variables, more complexity, that we have so much more power to do these days to really understand what's going on. At a very micro example level that is so far below what we're going to talk about today, you know, I think about this way, oh, we have a region that has 3 clinics, you know, their average performance against their indicators and their, you know, people indicators is 80%. I guess the region's doing pretty good, you know, it's like a B, 80%. But if you have enough data, you say, oh, wait a second. 2 of the clinics are operating at 95%, and 1 of the clinics is operating at 50%. Something's going on there. Either something's going on with that clinic, or the people are going there, or the people who aren't going there, but something has to have an intervention. But if you just look at the average and you don't bother to interrogate, dive deeper, look with granularity, you're not going to have a solution. You're not going to find a solution that helps and serves people. I think the second reason for this series is really that we're at a timing of explosion of data tools and big data and ability to make sense and model with the data, but especially that we have amazing alumni and professors and partners around the DC area too, who are doing incredibly creative, meaningful, and important things with these sort of data skills. That's my long introduction to the series, so I can give you an even longer introduction to our fabulous, wonderful speaker today, Mr. Don Leka, who is an SIS 1986 graduate and a Kogod 1997 MBA graduate. So welcome to an alum. Big round of applause there. Don has a really long series of successes and adventures since he's left SIS. He's the creator of Genesis J2T Artificial Intelligence. He's the creator of Jumptuit and creator of Glide OS. Founder, chairman, CEO of the Jumptuit Group with over 15 years experience creating industry-changing and award-winning artificial intelligence, data systems, cloud, and mobile technologies. Don's ethos throughout his career has been to create value, to empower individuals, and protect the sanctity of data. In the late 80s, as a recent SIS graduate, Don immersed himself in bringing economic development, technology, and humanitarian assistance to Eastern Europe, coordinating with various U.S. government agencies from state to USAID to Peace Corps, as well as with NGOs and the private sector. He was fascinated by the internal and external factors, economic and political issues of these societies that had created the conditions for social, political, and economic disruption at that time in the region. And then fast forward into the early 2000s, Don's experience developing pioneering cloud and mobile technologies and AI ultimately led to the combining of his passions for international relations and data systems building. The challenge of applying AI and data science to the understanding of global events has become essential in our increasingly interdependent world. Don was just awarded a couple of AI patents, and these inventions speak to his work that lies at the intersection between cloud computing, AI, data science, and the social sciences. Don's been featured in major media outlets and is the author of a top-selling book, Cloud Computing, The Glide OS Story, Solving the Cross-Platform Puzzle. And I could go on and on and on, but I think no one speaks better for Don than himself. And he's going to introduce us to this amazing, creative, and meaningful world that he is building as we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Hader. And we have a lot to go through. So I'm going to just kind of jump in and let's see if we can move ahead into the presentation. So starting at AU, I did find this clipping from the Eagle, which is, the newspaper here. I don't know if you guys still use that, but a lot of student activism at the time, and I was involved with the coalition against apartheid and racism at the time, and it was a very exciting time. In that period of time, that was really kind of a central issue that we all kind of gathered around, and so I would say I got that kind of kick into, wanting to change the world in a better way and to improve it at that time, right here on this campus, as so many of you do. And so, I wrote an article to the New York Times, only a year later, and it was published, and it was dealing with what was at that time the human rights conditions in the former Yugoslavia. So at that time, there were, quite a number of different ethnic groups. Some had republics, some had autonomous provinces. So I really learned a lot about group grievance, which is one of the issues that obviously affects a lot of global instability in the world. Then I just jumped into the unknown and jumped into the chaos. So I, had the opportunity to actually travel to Albania, which had no diplomatic relations with the United States and no corresponding banks. So there was literally nothing. Albania originally was aligned with the Soviet Union. Then it broke with the Soviet Union. It was aligned with China. And eventually just said, let's go it alone. So they had very much of an isolationist approach to things. So by the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and you saw the dominoes of countries that fell, the communist governments there, Albania was kind of the last one. But I literally show up there in 1990, towards the end of the year, and we start working closely with them, organizing humanitarian assistance, trade, try to get them support for agriculture, training doctors and engineers. So this is kind of interesting. If you read this, you'll see that the U.S. our agencies had a very difficult time organizing aid and assistance to the country. So you can see they were very frustrated at that point. And, this is where you have to take initiative and just go out and do it. So, I spoke with SmithKline Beecham. They agreed to donate hepatitis B vaccines to the country. And we took care of about 10% of the need that they had for vaccines at that time, which was pretty significant for, a young kid coming out of college. Shortly thereafter, I end up in a revolution. So I fly into Tirana, which is the capital for meetings with the various ministries. This was on February 20th. And the very next day, we had this out. February 19th, I flew in. The next day, the revolution broke out. And I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I was like, this is amazing. So not only I jumped into the unknown, I jumped into the chaos and was able to capture actually live footage. You won't be able to hear the audio, but you would actually see the gunfire. And this was literally what was happening at that time. So you can see the tanks and they're guarding certain buildings here. The crowd is gathering to, ultimately they take down the statue of the dictator in the square. And you can see the tanks. They're protecting the block area where the communist, leaders live. So you talk about factionalized elites, which is another concept. They were the factionalized elites in the sense that they were, protecting themselves at that given moment in time. Against the backdrop of this chaos, I was traveling with the prime minister of Albania at this time, and anyone recognize that person there on the screen? Yeah, you see that's who it is. Does anyone else recognize who that is? That was Elaine Chao. So one of her first gigs, one of her first positions that she took was head of the Peace Corps. And so this is the signing of the Peace Corps agreement between the two countries. So this is happening now with an interim government. So the issue of state legitimacy comes into play now. You have an interim government. It was called the government of stability, but those governments don't usually last very long. And sure enough, it did not. So, but we were able to successfully get that agreement signed, and then the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. So the person who ran that actually was handling the transition team for the Bush administration at the time, Ambassador Fred Zader. He's no longer with us at this point. But we were able to do an incredible amount just as individuals to interact and, kind of build this trade, build these relationships and bring this value into the relationship. And we coordinated with the State Department. Ultimately, USAID, the Open Society Foundation, which is George Soros, funded a foundation that I was the executive director of. To get support for that initiative from the government, I actually wrote letters that Claiborne Pell at the time, who was a Democrat, and Bob Dole, who was a Republican, both signed. I adjusted them. I changed, like one was fully justified, the other was left justified. One said sincerely, the other said kind regards. And at the time, I believe they faxed those into USAID. That was on the Senate side. And on the House side, it was Elliot Engel, and then also Susan Molinari was a Republican at the time. So they sent those in, and that was enough to kind of initiate that and get that off the ground. Eventually, Albania did stabilize. And so here you can see, this is the 100-year anniversary of the country, which I was invited to by the president of the country at the time. So it was just an exciting journey. And that was kind of something that very much led into the things I do today. So my transition to technology fully had a lot to do with Steve Jobs coming back to Apple in 1997. So I loved Apple. I always, loved to play with computers and technology. And so that was really influential for me. But I also love Robert Noyce as well. I love he's one of the founders of Intel. And so don't be encumbered by history. Go off and do something wonderful. I think that's one of the interesting challenges. And one of the foundations of our platform is, if we only study history, we're destined to repeat it. So we always hear, if we don't study history, we're destined to repeat it. If we only study history, we're destined to repeat it. So one of the premises of the technology we built is that we try to capture in as close to real time a full cross-sector understanding of events prior to the genesis of an actual event that could be destabilizing. So we're looking very much horizontally, whereas all the other solutions are very much vertical. So the way these systems are generally designed is you have a data lake, and then you run trained machine learning models on that data. But the problem is it's the external shock. It's the external factors that are critical. And these models don't pick up those external shocks. And we'll visualize that for you today and how it affects everybody. So this is my journey through tech very quickly. Glide OS, we built an entire cloud-based operating system. In 2005, I went out to 40 media organizations thinking one would write about it. They all wrote about it. This is before Google Cloud. This is before Apple iCloud, before everything that you see today. And it's on CNBC. And it was just like, wow, this is pretty cool. I just built this and then it just took off. So it was the most popular web OS up to 2012. And as Mike started to move into the cloud space with Office 365, we started to pivot, and we actually ended up partnering with Microsoft and with Google as opposed to competing with it. And so we shifted over to Jumptuit at that point. And so that was kind of a critical moment. And because I had this data system and I had, built this platform that connected all of your cloud services, we had so much data to work with that we were the perfect partner for them too, to test their machine learning models on. So I had that benefit and got to learn and watch it organically and evolve, and then evolve from there. So that was our trajectory with Jumptuit. You can see our partnerships with Microsoft, my presentations at TEDx, Google, and then you can see IBM, and then ultimately building this very unique AI, which we're getting patent applications, patent grants for. So we're super excited about the approach we've taken, which is very unique, as you'll see momentarily. So very quickly, we're basically looking at some critical aspects: jurisdiction risk, sector risk, industry risk, and company risk. And prior to an event occurring, we're looking at all of these external factors that could potentially cause instability. So we're looking at it in an early stage, and we're saying if there's a probability for this, who's likely to be impacted by that? And we'll give you some very specific examples of that as we go through it. But the purpose is to reduce that external shock. It's risk mitigation. So every company, every S&P 500 company, every privately held company has a cost of risk. And that cost of risk is generally for S&P 500 companies can be in the hundreds of millions, it could be in the billions of dollars. For industries and sectors, they're enormous. And they're not very good at seeing these external shocks in different regions and parts of the world. Also, I'll point out that the global supply chain, with the efficiencies that it has created, also has a lot of risk exposure. So what was much more localized, at past points in time, now those efficiencies are there, the output capacity has been increased, and the speed of delivery has been increased, but also the risk has been multiplied, because if anything goes wrong anywhere along that supply chain, it could be a mudslide, it could be a coup d'etat in a country, it could be anything. So that's what everyone is looking to protect against, to stabilize that. So very much here, again, focused on that cross-sector index, and we're thinking horizontally. I think that's been the big problem. If you're not multidisciplinary, I became multidisciplinary for sure over time, as the dean is as well, through her own unique experiences. And when you are multidisciplinary, you start to see patterns. And language within each discipline doesn't scare you, because it's just a language you have to learn. A lot of people are afraid of that because they don't understand that. And also, when you're in international relations, you're a student in that area, or political science, oftentimes you have a fear of numbers or quantification of problems. And so that's something that you just have to, again, just jump into and understand that understanding those numbers is going to help you to understand problems and help you to solve problems as you go along. So I had that phobia too, and I don't have it at all anymore. I found myself to be pretty logical, therefore very mathematical, especially as the math gets more advanced. That's where it gets more interesting. So really a couple of key elements here. We call it event genesis intelligence, EGI, internally, real-time cross-spectrum data, and our global data net. So we've erected global data nets in various regions, all regions around the world, and in all major sectors. And so we're pulling private data, public data, and we're pulling it to as close to real-time as possible, okay? So we're going to do a demonstration, but I just wanted to give you guys a quick rundown on a couple of, I'll give you one example now, we'll go further as we go into it. So let's talk about Ukraine. So this, if you look at, I don't know if you guys can see the date at the bottom of the screen. So that's just prior to the invasion of Ukraine. So at that point, Russia controlled Crimea, and through its proxies, Russian separatists, you can see in Donetsk. This is what it looks like now. So that whole area that you see in red is controlled by Russia, and very little has changed here in the last 8 months in reality of the situation. So one of the critical bases of formulating the policies at the time. So let's say they invaded in February. By March, the G7 is reacting to the United States. The basis was that if these sanctions were applied and the Russians were kicked off the SWIFT system and a series of coordinated activities, that Russia would not have the money to be able to fight the war, and so would end very quickly. April 1st, 2022, I'm on stage saying we're looking at real-time trade between Russia and China and Russia and India in particular. And India actually over the year increases its trade by some estimates by as much as 10 times. And Russia and Argentina and Russia and Brazil and all of these different countries. April 1st, 2022, I say we see no change in those trading patterns. And as we continue to track it by May and June, we could see that Indian refinery companies were asking the Russians for more production of natural gas, or for crude rather. And the Russians were saying, we can't produce anymore, we're at capacity. We were picking up early signals from Indian publications that cover the energy sector. So we were able to see those signals. The original projections on GDP contraction as a result of the sanctions ranged from the White House, which issued a statement 5 days after I was speaking on April 6th, that Russia's GDP would contract by 15%. Barclays, JP Morgan, every think tank, every major, the World Bank was at 11.2%. So every intergovernmental organization was generally somewhere between 10 and 15%. In fact, Moody's had contractions as great as between 13% and 25%. And their job is to assess risk. So, but there's a cost for this. And if we don't calculate properly, if people understood that these sanctions were not going to be as effective as they were, other policies or other things could have been added. It could have been a different mixture of actions that were taken. And maybe those would have been more effective. Just so we understand, 13 million plus refugees and IDPs that have come out of that country. Casualties not even reported. Those will come out later. And the New York Times had an article today saying, the front page, saying that Russia is producing more missiles today than it was before the war began. Now, this is a geopolitical battle. And what we're looking at here is the Sahel. And you guys are probably aware of, over the last 3 years, since 2020, we've had coups d'etats in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and we've had conflict in Sudan, and we just had a coup d'etat, which you don't see here, in Gabon as well. So you're seeing, particularly targeting a lot of the French former colonies. And looking forward from that, you can see that we have an election coming up in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So that's going to be very interesting to see what kind of unrest comes out of that. Also in Senegal, the lead opposition figure was arrested, was just on a hunger strike, and only a few days ago ended his hunger strike. So there's more to come in the Sahel, but this is a geostrategic battle in Africa. The Chinese are involved, mostly buying mines and other types of things, and the Russians are involved, and we're involved, and so it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. So with that, I'm going to jump into the demo, so we can go right into the product itself. So what you're looking at here is instability indexes for every country in the world that we tabulate. And we're looking at some of these critical factors like demographic pressures, refugees and IDPs, group grievance, human flight and brain drain, economic inequality, the economy, all kinds of economic variables, state legitimacy, which I talked about a little bit earlier, public services, human rights, security apparatus, factionalized elites, we talked about that, and external interventions. So external interventions can be mercenaries, they can be, just about anything. It could be actually loans that are given to countries to build infrastructure, for example. That's an external intervention, and that gives certain leverage to the countries that are doing those things. So those are the kinds of things that we're tracking, but we're tracking them collectively to create economic instability indexes, political instability indexes, social or civil unrest indexes. We're tracking climate events as well, separately, because climate events will impact everything you see here. Everything, demographic pressures, it's going to impact the economy. And it's interesting, the way these intergovernmental organizations do this today is they're not organizing these data points properly. So they have climate kind of mixed in with demographic pressures and like situating it there. So somebody decided to put it there as opposed to make it an independent variable that affects everything else. So those are the sorts of things. But the big problem is mostly that they're working with historical data and they're not able to compute the multiplier of risk across these factors and variables. Okay. So just to be fair on time, I got to move pretty quickly here. So let me clear that out. So we're tracking critical waterways around the world. This is pretty significant. So I'm not sure if you guys know that the Panama Canal has had some serious droughts, and that's affecting the number of ships that can actually get through. It also has impact in Taiwan. You know, if there is a conflict to break out, it's going to be very difficult for the U.S. to get ships through there, and they might have to go the long way, you know, if they have to get more ships. There's only so many ships. There's a less number of ships that can actually get through. One of the key lakes that they rely on has a serious drought. That's right there. So we're tracking all those critical waterways, just to give you a sense of that. We're going to world cities really quick, and I'll just drop in. So the day that the Wagner Group was going up through Russia, we were tracking 1,211 cities in Russia. And I was actually communicating with someone here on that Saturday morning. I took over my screen, and my wife was not happy because it was a Saturday morning. She also graduated from the American University. So we met here and we got married. She became a journalist and was on air for 16 years, CNN and everywhere. But I was reporting back to some people in Washington. We're not seeing any regional governors. We're not seeing any mayors. We're not seeing any battalions. Nobody's coming over to the Wagner Group. So we had those early signals that was not going to be effective, but the government was just in a reactive state at that point, not really knowing how that was going to play out. But you can see here, every single city, we can dive in. We don't have time to do it now, but we can zoom right in and we can explore. And we focus on, this is very important, hyper localized news. So we try to circumvent the Google algorithm because you're going to get a lot of the same information through that Google algorithm. So that took a lot of work to actually construct that. And so, of course, we have the information that comes through the Google algorithms, but we go beyond that because local news is something that's there's a lot more signals in there. It's not as easily controllable. And so you're able to get that information. So critical stuff. Okay, so let's kind of jump ahead there. So we'll jump into mines and minerals quickly. So this is another event that we were able to really get ahead on. So last year, Peru had elections. I'll just bring up copper here. And 3 months prior to the election in December, we had early signals that there was a high probability there was going to be social unrest after the election. Sure enough, there was. Then we were looking for potential interruptions to the supply chain there and who would potentially be impacted by that. And so Peru is the second largest producer of copper in the world. And so by the first week of January, we had a probability of over 0.7 that there was going to be a disruption. And by the middle of February, the Chinese, who control the largest copper mine in Peru, shut down the mine. This caused the price of copper to go up. It caused shortages and it caused companies in sectors like the electronic sector, construction sector that rely on that to have to go to alternative sources. But at this point, the prices were higher. So the ability to mitigate risk in a situation like this is that if you knew that the first week of January, all you had to do was go to the Chilean mines. Chile is the largest producer of copper in the world, and add a clause to the agreement saying, we'd like the opportunity to buy more copper at this price, which was the price in January, over the next 6 months. The companies that did that would be able, but none of these companies have the capacity to do that, and that's very important. So how do we know specifically what companies can do that? Or, would be impacted, I should say. So we're going to take a look really quickly. So for every single publicly traded company and for many private companies, we know every single GICS code and SIC code. So we know what sectors they're in, we know what subsectors they're in. So just look at this arc of data. We're starting prior to the genesis of an event. We're tracking the jurisdictions that will be impacted. We know what minerals they have and supplies they have and what they produce and what they manufacture. And therefore, we know what sectors, what industries, and what companies are most likely to be impacted. So let's take a look at the global supply chain. I'll give you one quick example there. So we'll go to S&P 500 companies. I'll bring up one that we all know and love. I certainly do. So that's Apple's global supply chain. So anywhere along that supply chain, if any event occurs, it could be highly disruptive to their production. The iPhone itself, just the iPhone, over 40 suppliers that produce components, or, there's minerals or whatever you need, rare earths that are used. If there's a mudslide at one of those facilities, and you can see them all here below, if I bring them up, you can see we have them all. We know exactly their geolocation. So as we're assessing risk of events, it could be political risk, it could be social, a civil unrest risk, it could be a climate event, it could be anything. We're able to, based on those geolocations, we know exactly where that is and say that's likely that there's going to be some type of disruption there. Okay. So we'll jump ahead now and we'll take a look at the ocean. So we're tracking everything, guys, by the way. So I'll show you. Actually, let me just jump into two things very quick. I know we're short on time. I'm going to go into Niger for a minute. And so that's Niger. Okay, those are all the key cities there. Now, three things about Niger. Why was Niger so important to the Russians, for example? And why is it so important to the European Union? So for the European Union gets 25% of its uranium from Niger, 25%. And Europe relies heavily on nuclear power, number one. Number two, just after the war broke out, the Europeans knew that there would be a drop-off in natural gas from Russia there. So they went to Niger and they went to the Nigerians and said, let's build this pipeline within 1 year, and so that the European Union could get about 10% of its natural gas requirements. And now, because of this coup that just occurred there, that's not happening. The Iranian shipments aren't happening. And also quite interesting here, I'm going to zoom right into Agadez. So Agadez is where the United States has an air base that it flies Reaper drone, other things, and tracking Boko Haram and ISIS and other groups there. The French also fly flights out of there. So that has been interrupted, and they're not flying as many flights out of that as well. So huge instabilities, but you can see these things are all connected. This is see, when you start to look at things narrowly as a conflict in one area, as opposed to seeing the connection between these things. Okay. Now, we can I should show you the oceans quickly. So we show you the buoys in the oceans. We've been tracking ocean temperatures. So that's a lot of fun. And we'll go down to Florida. And we're also going to go down to the Southwest US. So this is live. We're going to pull live temperature. So this is bypassing reports and everything. You're just going to the buoy directly. It's going to tell us. And what's very interesting is, how long do you guys think? I'll ask you a quick question. How long do you think buoys have been in the ocean that are tracking meteorological data, water temperature, air temperature?
At least 80 years.
How long?
75, 80.
How many? Let me ask you differently. How long do you think that the ones that are still operational? Let's go back to how far back in time do you think we have buoys that would have been able to capture, let's say, water temperature and air temperature from a specific location? 1973. There's only 4 active buoys from 1973. If you go back to 1983, it's 20-something buoys. You go to 1993, you're still under 100 buoys. And when you get to 2003, you have 112 active buoys. So you have 20 years of data to work with. Of those 112, only 86 have data for every single month of those 20 years. Of those, some of them have 60 days worth of data, some have 300 days. So extraordinarily inconsistent data. And you think buoys are not that expensive. You could drop 10,000 buoys into the ocean, right, systematically, and find out what's going on. But we're tracking the hottest and coldest years, hottest and coldest months. So you can see the coldest months on record. Simultaneously this year, Florida, off the coast of Florida, we had some of the hottest water, right, on record, which is a very short period of time, but still on record. But how many people know that in San Diego, there were record cold water temperatures in San Diego this year, and off the coast of San Francisco as well? So interesting. They could all be climate change, the cold, the hot, but there's a lot going on out there. Okay. Finally, we could go on and on. So, but I just wanted to give you guys kind of a generally broad view. But do you want to continue? Keep going. It's up to you. Or
we have about 20 minutes right now, and
okay,
a few times for questions and answers. We've got a few more minutes.
Okay, great. So we're able to not only bring this intel down to an individual S&P 500 or private company, but down to an individual's workflow. So this is me. You're actually looking at me in data. Okay, only 4% of me, because otherwise the browser would crash. Anything more than that, the developers have assured me the browser is going to crash. But this allows the tailoring of intelligence right down to my workflow. So very specific projects that I'm working on. So this goes on and on and on. And we're running massive amounts of machine learning on every image, every video, every document, every email, every calendar event, only in the work environment. We don't do this in a consumer environment. So this is strictly to augment and create a personal AI to effectively help you with your workflow. So essentially, that's the focus and element of that. And that allows us to do things like this. So I can go into my individualized workflow stream. I can drop down, for example, to this topic here, tensions in the Balkans, NATO, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Albania. So there's this arc you're seeing where all of these tensions are occurring, and everything's related to everything else. That's what I would encourage everybody to understand, is that when there's these geostrategic battles going on, don't look at it in a localized way. Understand the full battle that's underway. But you can see here, very specific targeted information here. You can see all of the key individuals. These are the presidents and the defense ministers of all of these countries. These are the specific locations, both countries and cities. These are some of the key statements. So this gives you we run sentiment analysis on that. So this gives you a sense of how tense things are across that region. 3 of those countries are NATO countries, which is North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Albania, and then Serbia is there as well, but it's not a NATO country. So monitoring these things in real time, understanding what's happening. I'll show you one more. So let me see if I can bring it to one of the critical issues of our time, of course. Well, there's a lot of stuff on nuclear global sentiment out there. There you go. All right, so we can take a quick look in here. So these are some of the key organizations at the UN that are or speaking at the UN. So we're picking up every statement by every foreign leader at the UN, running sentiment analysis on that, and understanding what the escalation is. How much more serious are things getting? You can see here, of course, the Russian Federation is very high up there. You see Robert Wood, I'm sure you know who that is, right? One of our ambassadors. Obviously, Putin and Lukashenko there, you can see. And as you get to some of the statements, we'll kind of go down here. This will give you a sense of the stress. Some of the critical statements, and we'll see more this month as well. I'd love to do this live for you, but I think we're probably out of time, so I can.
Well, let's have a first round of applause
Okay.
and let's have a couple. Great, so we're. Well. All right, so we're going to move our question and answer mic up to the front so that if you have questions, please come up to the mic so folks can hear you. And I'll take a couple of first prerogative questions as we get started. So we are on the countdown next week to UNGA, to the UN General Assembly. Given what you're monitoring, how you're monitoring, what are you going to be keeping your eyes most peeled for, and what topics do you think are going to explode the most?
It's good.
There you go.
It's a good question. So we will share with you what we're seeing. So we'll be running an analysis on that, and but certainly nuclear will be a huge topic. A lot of the issues around ESG and all of the issues around climate change will be very central as well. In fact, I'm traveling to the Middle East actually for the COP28. This is coming up as well. So we'll see that. Obviously, there'll be discussions about what's happening, in the various hotspots around the world. But we'll be able to pick up that sentiment and share that with you. And if you want to share it, you can share it with everybody.
That'd be great. There are 3 pandemic treaties or health treaties being discussed in terms of TB pandemics, and I think maternal health. And I think our lay predictions are there's going to be very little discussion of them and very little bandwidth compared to these other issues. So let's see what comes out on that. Can we get folks with questions? Go ahead and come back up. I was hoping Matt would kick us off. Introduce yourself before I say, and here's our guru in political risk analysis.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm Matt Taylor. I'm a professor here. I teach on Latin America, and I also teach on political risk analysis. So this is fascinating, and I would love to just dive in and see all the data that you've got. I bet. And I guess my questions are twofold, but they're related. The first is, what is the role of the country expert? What you described here is sort of a lot of terrain analysis, what I would call, what is the underlying terrain? And you talked about exogenous shocks that would trigger risk. And I'm kind of curious, how do you interpret all of that? And what is the role of the country expert in that? So that's the first question. The second question is about, for example, you had the instability index, and I was curious, what is the aggregation methodology there? Because I could imagine a number of ways of doing it. Some of this may be proprietary, so I don't want you to speak beyond what you want to talk about, but I'm curious, how do you put this all together in a way that's pulling out the correct information and the correct signals? Thank you.
So I'll answer the first part of your question in this way, that we remove the interpretive layer completely. From the analysis of events that are occurring. We remove frameworks, constructs, belief systems, political ideologies. We just go to the satellites. We run massive machine learning. We capture drone images, stationary cameras, buoy data. And then when we go to data that human beings manage, we use primary data sources. So we go to the most reliable primary data sources. And that's where experts are helpful as you go to different parts of the world. Who's going to be more accurate in this or that in terms of what GDP predictions are high, low, and so on. The second thing we do is we look primarily at real-time data or near real-time data. Our view is that the closer we get to the currency of the event, our forecasts, as we do our scenario forecasting, it's going to be more accurate. So that's another big change in terms of how these things are done. So we're removing the room full of analysts out of the room. The country officers get the data, and then they can work with that data and still make their assessments. Policies are based on interests. So the United States makes, and so does every other country, bases their policies on interest. But they should be working with accurate data. And I think it's critical to understand that when we're not working with accurate data, you get 13 million refugees out of a population of 44 million people. That's equivalent to 100 million Americans being displaced in 1 year. There's a lot of collateral damages. If the forecasts are wrong, the policies have collateral damage, and then we don't have moral outcomes. So we have to think about morality from the standpoint of outcomes. What's the most moral outcome as we develop our policies? We think of morality more on the front end of the policy formation. So I think that's another critical piece. So those are some of the critical pieces. As far as the variables and factors, we looked at the working papers at the IMF, and we went to the absolute bleeding edge of what is happening out there, and very little is happening. They try to understand where the next revolution is going to happen based on what happened in Tunisia, a decade ago. And they're not going to understand what's happening in Argentina or in Indonesia or some other country from that, because all these variables are different. And one thing I will say, when we see real-time data, this is an extraordinary thing. 3 seconds into the future, 5 seconds into the future, certain variables fall off. Other variables come into play, and they're all weighted differently every time. So there's only the next pattern. This idea that there's these historical patterns, it's just a device that gives us a certain degree of comfort. In fact, things are constantly changing. And if you've thought about it, you think about, wow, things are completely different today than they were 10 years ago, right? And you could think about all the different ways, but AI helps you to do that and instantly and understand that. So I hope I answered some of them.
Other questions? Come on up. Please, feel free and introduce yourself.
So, hi, I'm Caleb. I'm a sophomore student and also a finance major. So I was really curious. You mentioned how early in your career, you're almost scared of working with numbers, right? You're very uncomfortable with it or just data. So what did you do to make a shift to really coming to embrace it and to love it to the point where you are today?
So I think part of it's personality type, but I definitely, part of it is something that is a conscious decision that you make. So you have to continually leap into the unknown. You know, when I first wrote a letter to the New York Times, I know that there were PhDs and specialists who were writing, and you guys don't understand this as well, but at that time there was no internet. So to get on the editorial page of the New York Times is a big deal, right? You're fighting for very limited real estate. And the New York Times had a stature that was very high at that time. You know, but you just have to do it, even though you're not really ready to do it, you do it. And someone else will decide if you're ready or not. You know, the Washington Post contacted me. I had no idea if we were ready to do that. You do it. You know, you jump into a situation where you don't know what the outcomes are. So, I mean, I also, by the way, I had an internship on Capitol Hill. I worked on Wall Street and futures and options at one of the biggest financial institutions. I don't even talk about it. I don't even think about that anymore, right? What was interesting was the adventures. So I really think you have to think about your life from the standpoint of your area of study should be adventure. I mean, I really, really believe that. And today, everything is cross-sectional, it's horizontal. All of the solutions rely, or all the solutions to solve the problems we have today are cross-discipline, they're cross-sector. And if you're not thinking that way, you're not going to be able to assess risk properly, whether it's for a large bank, a large insurance company, or for the US government.
Other questions? Come on up. Maybe while folks are, go ahead. Yes.
Hello, I'm Henry. I'm a first-year graduate student studying U.S. foreign policy, and I was wondering, with this system that you've developed so far, it appears that you have the ability to pull up, extremely deep data sets and charts of all this data that you can then analyze. Are you developing for the ability for sort of the deep learning algorithm to pinpoint predictions that you aren't looking for yet to preempt crises that you haven't thought of?
So that's a great question. So our system is threshold based. So we have ranges and we have thresholds. And what we do is we standardize metrics across different sectors so we can measure them in relation to each other. So we're not pointing at something. We're alerted to something, that there's a possibility this can occur. There's a probability. One of the big errors also, I think, is that people think that there's a single future. There is no single future. The future is dependent on the policies that we choose, and the outcomes will be dependent on those policies. So great question. So this is something that just, it sits kind of in a state where if everything's in its normal range in a particular region or jurisdiction, you're not getting those alerts. But as soon as one threshold is, it goes above that threshold or below that threshold, that triggers a daisy chain of looking at other variables that haven't crossed those thresholds, but we might see some trends in those. We do that also because economically, the cost of running the system is extraordinary. I mean, you're doing this in real time. Just think about how much it costs to just run a data lake. ChatGPT, I think they say it costs $800,000 a day to operate that. This fully implemented, what we've done here, will cost a lot more than that, to give you a sense, because you're doing it in real time and you're constantly grabbing these snapshots of data. But great question.
Other questions? Come on up. And I would say, in my worldview, great questions should lead to great internships, maybe. Just saying.
I agree. I believe, when I was at School of International Service, everybody would say, what are you going to do with that? What are you going to do with that? What are you going to do with that? I don't want to insult the people at Kogod because I did get my MBA, and it's important and it's a good skill to have. But this is way more valuable if you apply it properly, because you have the opportunity to assess risk. And if you can assess risk properly, you can help to avoid, circumvent, and bypass events. And that's hugely valuable to companies. You're going to save them hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's the financial incentive. So there's a financial alignment, but from a moral standpoint, you have an opportunity to stop, tragedies from occurring. So you get both benefits from it.
Hi, my name is Joyce Leischer. I'm a sophomore with the Living Learning Community, AU Compass. I'm an SIS major hoping to double in secondary education. First of all, I wanted to thank you for your presentation. It's actually gotten me thinking about looking at numbers again, which I've avoided for a very long time in my education. But I would like to know if J2T is tracking lower and higher education internationally? And if J2T isn't, are there plans or opportunities to analyze such education rates? And what would this process entail?
Another great question. So education is one of our verticals. So that's one of our vertical targets. We're taking a different approach. So our view to solve the problems when it comes to unleashing human potential, because that's what it's about. Think about how arcane the process is today. You have 20 kids or 25 kids or 30 kids in the classroom and one teacher. Every one of those students learns differently individually. The answer is to augment the individual in that learning process. All of these solutions that are being proposed have not worked, regardless of which political side. They've all failed to kind of bridge that gap. But I'll give you an example. I met an African-American woman who had not finished high school. She had a great idea for a product. She actually built the product, and it was really cool. And she actually was improving it continually. She was incredibly compelling. She was an entrepreneurial spirit. Any investor would want to invest in her. And I'd met her by accident, and it wasn't like something specific to business. And so I asked her, how are you funding this? She said, my salary and my husband's salary. I'm like, okay, do you know what a subscription agreement is? Because that's how you raise money. She didn't know what a subscription agreement is. She didn't have that experience, right? And I asked her, did she have a marketing plan? And she did not. So I went to an incubator for women-run businesses in New York, and I met with them. But they also fund businesses with men. And I met with a woman who was also African-American, by the way, but she had graduated from Harvard. And so she asked me what I did, and I went through a whole process of what I do. She said, we'd be very interested in investing in you. What you're doing is amazing. I said, well, I know how to raise money, and I'm not here for me. And I explained to her what needed to happen. But and ultimately she agreed at the end to meet with her. At first she was reticent because it wasn't the right pedigree. So you see, she didn't have the education. She didn't go to the same schools. And so it's extremely complex. But at the end of the day, every business plan or any kind of initiative has a timeline from the idea to an expiration date. And if you don't have access to the people, the financial resources, the mentorship, that will expire no matter how driven you are and how much you want it. So we have to re-envision education completely. Not to mention the fact that certain people just learn differently. I mean, individuals learn differently, right? And they have so many gifts to contribute. So we have a great plan for that.
Other questions? Feel free to make your way up to the mic. It's a long track.
Hello, my name is Julian Weiss. I'm also in the living learning community. It's much cheaper housing, but and a great professor too. I'm a double majored in history and political science. I'm really, there's so many things I could ask about. You covered a lot. I'm interested, how do you assess, especially with state actors, who you want to do business with this technology? Who, if a government comes to you and says, we want to work with you, what are you thinking in terms of will we accept that or not?
So first I'll deal with that from a compliance standpoint. So the Department of Treasury has a group called OFAC, and they apply sanctions and other types of things. So you have a risk in terms of who you're working with, because it's not just the suppliers you're working with, it's the suppliers of the suppliers that are also involved. And if any of the suppliers of your suppliers are, let's say, doing business with Russia or some other country, you're going to be liable, and you're going to have to pay a big fine. The Department of Justice is going to say you didn't do your due diligence. So the ability to help companies track the probability of that is a huge thing that we do. In terms of, I think we're reversing that thought process. So we're looking at outcomes. We're interested in moral outcomes, right? And moral outcomes might mean potentially you might work with somebody. Like, for example, when I got those grants from USAID, I was a progressive, liberal graduate of the American University School of International Service, involved with the anti-apartheid movement. Okay, so, but to get that done, I couldn't control who the administration was. It was the Bush administration. So in order to get that done, I needed that bipartisan support. So I think this idea of who to work with and not to work with, we need to kind of shift to what the outcome is, because if the outcomes are tragic and they lead to massive refugee flows or death and destruction, or children who are growing up now in certain countries who are traumatized. That to us is where the focus is. So you have a better sense of that. That's kind of where we're looking. Of course, you're not going to work with certain people, but you understand what I'm saying. We're looking at it differently.
Yeah, I think that issue, that strange bedfellows sometimes on the surface, sometimes can be very powerful in construction and constructive sort of outcomes. Any other questions? Come on up. We'll take a couple of more.
I just met this guy yesterday on the Amtrak.
3 hours I sat next to him. I heard it's part of the spiel already. But it was good. It was compelling enough that I came here to listen today, and then I got to saw the pitch. And so I'm going to give you a softball dovetailing on the gentleman's that just came up there. My name is Aaron Brown. I'm here from the 2430 Group, an operational nonprofit that does open source intelligence. But related to this, I spent 15 years at CIA, and many of those places you zoomed in on trying to make these predictions in order to give policymakers strategic advantage at the point of decision. What you have up here in this data tool right now is advantage that's underutilized right now in the United States government. We talked about this a little bit on the train, so you're prepped for this. How are you finding engagement with the US government on data like this? I found it incredibly underwhelming from the inside. We're now on the outside trying to work on that. We had a long discussion about how maybe some of these outcomes could have been different if that information had been cleaner, crisper, and more accurate. And where do you see this going with the government, and how do you find them responding?
Great question. So we've met with very senior people in the government. We've had meetings at GSA. They understand, because they're the people who are in charge of procurement, that these technologies are not being applied in the government anywhere. So there's a clear understanding, and the ability to even look across the different departments of the government and have that data organized is just not there at all. So, we've seen a very positive reception there. I think people in the defense sector get it right away. I mean, real-time data, being able to assess the potential for an event occurring. Most of our systems are reactive. So we live in a highly reactive world. And so the idea of getting those early signals, seeing those cross-sector variables and factors, there is definitely a reception to that. There are entrenched political interests. There are people who were involved in certain policies over the last, let's say, 20 years. And they want to be right in history. So you do have some resistance pockets, right? So they write books to explain why they were right, even though you look at it like, how is that good? But you see a lot of that. So there is that problem. But generally, people are receptive. And what I'm really, really excited about is I see people across the political spectrum who say to me, I like what you're doing. I see people on the left. I see people on the right. It's just shocking given the polarization that exists today. So that's encouraging.
So maybe I will take the prerogative of the last question as well. And this is a little bit follow on, but in terms of what you're seeing in the United Nations. So as you know, I recently finished my stint as an Assistant Secretary General at the UN. While I was there, I was part of the Secretary General's High-Level Committee on Programs, which were all the program and technical policymakers across UN agencies. And I jumped into an agenda that this group had been meeting on every 6 months and was still meeting on during my 3 years. So that's at least 5 years of meeting. And two of the top topics, one was the future of work and sort of knowing what employment and unemployment opportunities around the world for young people meant for stability and everything else. And the second was artificial intelligence, AI. Where to for AI? And you could see from some of the notes that preceded me, there was first a surge on, all the potential of AI for achieving the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we had, better AI, could we have great leaps forward in the SDGs? And then there was a shift to all the attention being on the protections against AI and data protection. And I know that's been a real passion for you over times too. But it didn't result in a lot of actions or uptakes or recommendations or sort of like what I would consider agencies of the UN moving forward in looking at AI as a tool. So what have you been finding in your discussions with the United Nations? What do you see for the bright spots of hope? And what do you see in terms of your wish list of how you wish the UN would prioritize technology like yours?
So we've had recent meetings with the United Nations. They're receptive. They're receptive because they're in a highly reactive state. So they're looking for where food scarcity is going to occur. They're looking at where the next refugee flows are going to be, and they have no ability to predict these things. So I asked them, I said, what early signals did you have that Russia was going to pull out of the grain deal? And he really didn't have anything to say. And so I said, that ammonia pipeline that was blown up, the northern part, that it basically incapacitated that pipeline. There are official statements that came out of Russia saying that one of the prerequisites to get that grain deal operational was to repair the pipeline and get it operational again. So we picked up those signals. Now, we couldn't really get, I read the Financial Times, Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. I read all these publications every day, but we had to actually pull that, just those, let's say the terms from the actual Russian media, to pull those terms and factor that into the analysis. As a result, they did pull out of the grain deal. They donated free grain to Burkina Faso and other countries in Africa to gain their favor, obviously. And you can see what's happening now with the coups and everything that's happening there. And they're just in a reactive state. So I think there's a huge opportunity with the UN right now. They're receptive, they're listening. I mean, I was speaking with, Europeans have a different sensibility to speed in terms of, yes, but this and that. So it takes a little bit more navigation, but not that much more. They get it and frustrated because they can't solve these problems. So they're very receptive to this. Everybody is.
Great. Well, let me wrap this up real quickly with a few thanks. Thanks to Allison and Alice, who've helped us organize and pull off today. Thank you for Kelly and Lexi, who likewise helped to bring Don in and get us going and do the organization on this. Most especially, please join me in thanking Mr. Don Leka, our wonderful, illustrious alum. I think we had organized a reception afterwards that, what are the details? Where should I send folks? Just outside here. So please join us for a reception, stay and talk a little bit more. This is where if you were too shy to make your way up to the mic to ask questions, you can stalk with Don one-on-one. But thank you so much for coming out. And this is the first of many. So thank you.